Hello, Diet Soap viewers and listeners. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and this interview with Michael Albert is a one-off. But in the Parrot Room, you're going to be getting an interview with Kinzo Shibata, and he and I discuss what it means for him to be gender queer. So he should I say he sets me straight in the Parrot Room. Maybe. Anyway, tune in for that on the Patreon and enjoy this conversation with Michael Albert, the inventor of Paracon.
The most orthodox of all Marxist economists I have ever met.
The reason why I'm still a Marxist is that I claim that this structure of belief, of displaced belief, you find it in what Marx described as commodity fetishism.
That all really dialectical and intelligent human beings will have a sense for evil and some sympathy for the devil, or they will be just a little stifled in horror. I think that's not wrong. Just a little sympathy for the devil won't hurt.
Inside Critical Theory brings you this Diet Soap interview. Well, Michael Albert, welcome back and welcome to my new YouTube channel. I think you're going to be coming up on the new one here. We have been talking for several months about Paracon. You have a book coming out called No Bosses. So I want to help you get the word out about that book. But before we started recording, we were talking about the weird situation that the whole country is in right now, which sometimes may be missed by people on the left. But, there's the supply chain crisis. There's a labor shortage. There's inflation. And, I don't know what all else. But it seems as though, there's a lack of consumption as well. I think there's fewer people purchasing things because how could there be more people purchasing things when you try to purchase things, they're not there. So I have a broken smartphone, which by calling it a smartphone, by the way, that apparently dates me. I'm very old when I think of it as a smartphone. It's just a phone. I have an old phone and I need to get a new one. And I tried to buy a new one, and they're saying like it will arrive in mid-December. If I'm lucky. In fact, I think the order got canceled. Anyhow, we're talking about the fact that in the United States and maybe around the world, we've got a very strange economic moment. And part of the picture is that there are fewer workers who are wanting to work, and there are massive strikes, and there's a labor shortage.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you view it from the perspective of someone who wants to see workers empowered. You have this Paracon model. How do you think about the current labor shortage, and is it a good sign in some way for the left or not?
Yeah, I think it is good. Not that people are disrupted, people are hurting. That's not good. That's never good. But the response does seem to be, but it seems to be quite remarkable because it's almost like a national strike. I mean, it's sort of like that, but it's not organized. It's not as if there's an organization or even a set of organizations. I mean, sure, teachers are striking and that's organized. Nurses are striking and that's organized, and the coal miners. There are people who are striking, and it resembles what we're used to. That is, it resembles institutions, organizations of the left, and unions and so on, agitating and finally striking. Okay, so that's not unfamiliar. There's more of it. That's a good thing, obviously. But at the same time, there's something else, which is lots of people, without discussion even, without interaction, simultaneously changing their attitude about relating to the economy. I don't think it's that people are deciding they don't want to work, period. I think it's people are deciding they don't want to work in undignified, underpaid, denigrating, debilitating circumstances. But they're not moving toward fighting. They're just withholding. I mean, I don't understand it either. but I certainly don't think it's bad that working people are taking note of the circumstances of their work as well as the payment for their work. And that seems to be the case quite widely, that there's no organizational impetus of the thing suggests that it might not last and that it might not mature into something even greater. But hopefully it will. I guess we'll see. I know that's vague, and it reflects the fact that I'm vague about this. I don't have a good feeling for exactly what's happening or even why.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because like I have multiple theories about it, and some of them are kind of dark. I know that since 2008, the number of people who are kind of no longer counted as employable, who don't get counted when you count the unemployment statistics, has grown.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry that the labor shortage, the fact that the unemployment rate is not through the roof, but there's a labor shortage,
Right.
Strikes me as possibly explained by the fact that we have a lot of unemployable people in the country, people who are, no longer looking for work and haven't been for so long that they don't
Right.
count. But I'm not sure about that as being the explanation. The other piece of it would be the increase in homelessness that
Right.
seems to be going on, but I only have anecdotal evidence to support that. I just can go to downtown Portland and see the number of homeless encampments and how they're dominating the downtown area.
It's different in different places. It's certainly threatening to get out of hand. That's true.
So I worry about that. And then if you add in the fact that we have a supply chain crisis, so we have like a labor shortage, but we also have a shortage of raw materials or consumer goods, which would mean that in the service sector, there's simultaneously not enough people to do the job and also not enough goods for there to be a need to do the job.
It's also often that they can't transport them. They can't move them. And so you see these strange formulations that they're willing to pay almost bounties, or they're willing to bribe people to drive trucks and to do various things in order to move the stuff, and the ships that's on. There's another phenomenon that almost is parallel to this. That's also strange. So, the work at home dynamic, which obviously during the pandemic, was rooted in the pandemic, that giant increase in work at home, and that the inclination of many to want to do that and to see that as an improvement in their circumstances. And in some sense it is. You don't have to commute, and commuting is painful and costly. On the other hand, it's a little bit scary because it basically takes the workforce and scatters it all over the place, making it very difficult to fight for better circumstances and better wages and the like. And there's another side to it that I don't think anybody talks much about, which consider a big city. We'll consider New York. So if there is a trend or a transition, call it, to significant numbers of office workers working at home, that means all those tall buildings in New York are going to be partially occupied, right? With a significant reduction, maybe even a major reduction. That means all those stores and businesses throughout New York City on the first floor are basically done. I mean, just that fast. I mean, it means, I don't know what it means, but it's a major. I mean, people talk about it like it's not that big a thing. If there's really a transition from working in workplaces to working at home, it's immense.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of. I've been working at home for a long time now, and I can tell you there's an upside to it, but there's also a major downside to it. The downside is work never really stops.
Which is exactly understood by the employers.
The private life, your private life and your work life are not separated,
Yeah.
and Also, you're probably, I mean, I think in my case it's true and it's not good. You're probably going to be more sedentary
Yeah,
overall.
yeah.
You have less reason to get out and move around on a daily basis. I would also think that the increase in precarious work through freelancing and contracting is going to increase with the movement away from these storefronts near offices and instead to going to a model where everything's like DoorDash. You want something, you get it delivered. Amazon will get more and more powerful as pretty much everything is going to be deliverable. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
these are
all that
all
stuff's dystopian, basically.
yeah,
But on
yeah,
the other hand, the mindset has positive aspects to it. And so the issue really is an issue for us, people like us. It's to organize. It's to find a way to actually intervene in this whole thing and have an impact on what direction things move in and whether they keep moving in a positive direction. But absent that, we know what'll happen.
yeah,
The side that has power will take advantage of every change that comes along.
yeah. So with Paracon, you have this idea of job complexes.
Mm-hmm.
How would those, if you wanted to start to implement Paracon in this environment, could you do it in a situation where people were working from home and people were and the level of labor was down and there was a sense that people wanted to basically take back their lives and get paid for living privately rather than being involved in a public institution like a
I don't
workplace?
know. It's a good question. The idea of a balanced job complex is simple enough. It's not that complicated. In a workplace, you want a situation where the workforce, if you want a situation where the workforce is taking responsibility for the decisions. So the workers are making decisions, and the communities, citizens are making decisions. But if you want that, then you also have to want the workers to be inclined to make decisions, prepared to make decisions, have a personality, have a level of confidence, have a level of connection to others, et cetera, consistent with being a good decision maker. Otherwise, you get bad decisions. So you want all that. You want jobs, essentially, not to disempower most people, empower a few, and the few make the decisions. You want instead the whole workforce to be comparably empowered. Okay, how do you do that if work is atomized? That I think is maybe the key aspect. It's not so much home or not home; it's atomized. So, in other words, workers. So, what does that do to the tasks? Is it possible to have a combination of tasks, um, that isn't heavily weighted toward either empowering or disempowering? And what does it even mean to be empowered as an atom, separated from everybody else, distant from everybody else? I have no idea. I mean, these are things
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think anybody knows for sure. My inclination would be to say, yeah, you can do it, but would you want to do it? In other words, in a good economy, in a good society, do we want to atomize the population? To keep it as separate one from another as possible. Is that really the road to a better society? I'm disinclined to think so.
It was already on, the pandemic really intensified this, but it was already
Sure.
a trend, right? I mean, remote working was already on the rise. Certainly, having things delivered rather than going out to stores was already trending upwards significantly. Um, and I think it does. Look, I just know as someone who used to work in a call center that if I could have done that job from home, which I could have technologically, I
Mhm.
would have preferred that. It was a 2-hour commute. I went to a situation. I didn't feel connected to my fellow workers. I felt alienated from everyone in that call
Right.
center,
Right.
and I was being surveilled all the time. And I
But you're saying under a system like ours, a
mm,
grotesque abomination, right?
right.
Um, One thing is less abominable than another.
Yeah, no,
I
but I just
agree
think that
with you.
yeah,
I
right.
agree with
I
you.
think that's
Right.
why atomization is attractive because it does present itself as a kind of liberation
Yeah, a
for the
little bit
individual.
better than abominable. I
Right.
agree, and it
Right.
is a
Yeah.
little better than abominable, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
In various respects. I'm not sure over the long term it is, but in other words, even other things equal. But if you have massive agitation for a better society, then I'm not so sure that it would appeal
Right.
to people so much. That if workplaces were equitable and self-managing, and if the world out there was, congenial and positive experience, I don't think people would want to spend their lives behind four walls. Um, I just don't.
I
So,
agree.
so I agree with you completely that being not being boiled to death, being slow cooked to death is probably better. But
Mm. Yeah. Well, I guess the optimistic thing to consider, the way to find some hope in this moment, is to see the strikes, the kind of
yeah,
informal arrangement, as useful. But my fear, having been around a little bit, is that without institutional power and organizational power, that this will just dissipate. That these
yeah,
moments of uprising and moments of resistance, they come and they go. I've seen it
yeah,
happen again and again.
yeah,
Occupy would have been, I think, actually a smaller, less significant moment like this one. We're kind of missing it on the left that it's happening, but it's happening in a bigger way, I think, right now than
yeah,
Occupy ever
and
was.
with more constituencies. I think that's
Yeah.
true. But
Yeah.
Occupy had a little bit more cohesion among the people who were doing it, a lot more cohesion among the
Yeah.
people who were
Right.
doing it. But a
Mhm.
broader spectrum of people is now involved in this. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah,
But
this is even
I
less
don't think it's
political
just,
than the Yellow Vest movement, right? Which was
yeah,
also,
yeah, yeah.
similar kind of situation. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that missing is organization and connection, and but also I think vision. That is, I think it's very if what you have your eyes on, the prize that you have your eyes on is a short distance from where you are. In other words, the prize is a higher minimum wage. The prize is a little more flexibility in work hours. The prize, so if you have your eyes on that kind of a prize, it's easy, either if you lose or if you win, to dissipate. If
Mhm.
you have your eyes on a new society, but you believe in making progress in the present and having that progress lead toward that future thing, you're not as likely to dissipate. I don't think you don't dissipate at all. I mean, I could lose 1,000 times. It's not going to change the commitment to where I want to go, and uh,
Well, when you say that,
so
I
that
agree with you.
matters.
When you say that, I agree with you. I'm going to say something that's very Marxist, maybe in the worst sense, but yeah, I expect you to push back on me as hard as you want. But it seems to me that in order for people to hold on to a vision for a better society, they have to have some sort of political party that they're involved in that is seeking
Yeah,
political
no,
power.
there's nothing Marxist particularly about that.
Hmm.
What you're saying is that, I mean, a different way of saying the same thing is to retain commitments and to act on them. You need to not be the isolated warrior. That's very, very hard to do. There's no sustenance, there's no help, there's no sense of camaraderie, and what's more, you're weak. Um,
Hmm.
and so, yes, organization is essential. I agree with you. And it's also essential because organizations sort of congeal experience, and you don't have to start over again, right? So,
Hmm.
in other words, when it's movements that arise and decline, each one starts from scratch, more or less. Organizations and constituencies relating to can keep growing, can keep building upon what they've done. They don't go for a while, lose, and start over again and have to start from the beginning. Um,
Hmm.
so, for all those reasons, I, I'm not sure what's Marxist about it, except insofar as Marxists are often, more often than not, very sensible, and it's sensible.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, right. To have some sort of workers' party that's seeking state power, at least in the short term, like that's not the horizon of the vision, even for very statist communists. That's not supposed to be the end goal
right.
is state
But
power.
now
But
you've elaborated a bit.
mhm.
You slid some stuff under the surface there,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, a political organization, do you want to call it a party? I don't care. A political organization that has a structure that provides for its membership, that amplifies their skills and talents into more pressure. So far, we agree, I'm sure.
Mhm,
Then the next question is, what is it trying to do, right?
mhm,
Uh, I'm fine with it trying to win power throughout society's
mhm,
important institutions. And what are those? Well, workplaces, the government, and uh, also, religious institutions like
mhm.
churches, schools, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm with you. When you focus in a priori ahead of time on one purpose, you start to lose me a little because I don't think we know that that's what makes most sense, right? And
Mhm.
anybody who thinks that what makes most sense is either winning elections or somehow occupying the government and taking it over, and who sees instead a national strike, or who sees instead something else, which is pushing everything forward and has the vision and et cetera, we'll support it.
Well, I just remember May of '68, and how there was a national strike that was certainly probably more politically cohesive, more focused on creating a better society, more politically
Yeah,
conscious.
it was
And
all those things in
yeah,
space. Yes.
yeah, and um, it was something like 10 million workers in France were on strike at one point.
And the 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 scale of it was humongous. The scale of what happened in Greece not that long ago was also humongous, right?
Right.
After the repression of the anarchists in the anarchist neighborhood, that literally was what spurred it. And France in '68 was spurred by changes in the rules in dormitories. Um,
Yeah, that was
you
one
know,
of the things. Yeah, it was
that
funny.
was that was
That
the
started. It started at Nanterre,
yeah,
not even at the Sorbonne. It started like
yeah,
at
yeah.
Nanterre. A guy named Danny the Red or something like that. He was later a part
Daniel
of
Cohn-Bendit. But
yeah,
it was he was just one of the leaders. But it started just with rules
cohabitation rules.
changes that
Yeah.
people didn't like and they demonstrated against, and there was repression, and slowly it grew up. And it was
Mm.
beneath the surface that obviously there was a whole lot of desire and anger. And
Look, there was also a group of sectarian Marxists behind the scenes, pulling all the strings and writing very important books like the Society of the Spectacle. No, anyway, but there's a
uh,
mythos around
yeah, but
Guy
that's
Debord
nonsense.
and
But in
okay,
any event,
but let me just
go ahead.
actually say what I really believe, and not the
Okay.
nonsense. Um, what I really believe is that despite the successes that came out of that moment, and despite how big the movement was, what made it collapse, the way it was overcome, was through the not even the very harsh use of state power and changing the terms from occupying factories and occupying the streets and occupying the universities to what do the people want through the ballot, and that happened because the state had the ability to
Yeah,
change those
that's
terms,
certainly
and then
part
they
of it.
and the student movement and the workers movement couldn't get it together to bring forward a political candidate or a political party or political movement
Or
that
even
would
a
take state
program.
powers, or a program that they could all unify around and get people to
Right.
believe in
So
a conventional way through the ballot.
an
Yeah.
absence of shared vision, and an absence of shared strategy, a disparate kind of a phenomenon, et cetera, et cetera. But the way I used to think about it back then was, okay, so France is moving along. I can't do it. It's moving along and it's moving along. And then all of a sudden, it's just, this incredible surge. And it goes on for a few months and then right back to moving along and moving along. So you have, if it was a graph, it would be this giant peak. And the explanation of this is not obvious, right? How do you explain not only the surge, but the decline? And it's a decline that was in people's minds. So in other words, people went from relatively passive, business as usual, to bedlam, back to relatively passive, business as usual. And I don't think that was because at the at the point of takeoff, so to speak, everybody all of a sudden became incredibly conscious. They understood this, that, and the other thing that they didn't understand the day before or the week before. And I don't think that at the end it was because they had a lobotomy and they forgot all this incredible consciousness. And so they went back. It's nothing like that. I think it's more like no hope for a long time. Hope, bedlam, no hope. And and so the energy was unleashed by this feeling of power and of the possibility of real change. And that as long as that existed, it went. But when that declined, it didn't. There are pretty credible reports for your state power side of it that NATO tanks were being prepared in France to be used. In some ways, it might have led to more rather than less.
No, I know.
But in any
I think
case,
if they had brought in tanks, it would have changed. It would have hardened the movement. It would
left.
not have. Yeah, it would have hardened the
I
left.
think
It
so
would not
too.
have.
But you don't know. But in any event,
we don't know. But I just think that the fact that they could do it without that level of violence was what really undid.
But I do think that it was that a big fact. There's lots of factors, undoubtedly, but a big factor was that the thing was a surge, and it was based on hope, which came out of this crazy parietal hours surge, and then a bigger surge, and then a bigger, but never congealed. Now you're going to say into, and I'm going to agree with you, organized forms, right? Organized program, shared program, so that basically you have this whole movement. I mean, it's true in the 60s in the United States too. We shared the peace sign. Right? So you could drive down the street and give the peace sign, and somebody near the car would give the peace sign back. But what we didn't share was, what do we want beyond ending the war? What do we want beyond, right? That wasn't shared. And so a few setbacks, and depression sets back in, I guess. So I don't disagree with you about that. And so the emergence of, it isn't just a little organization. And maybe here we would disagree. I don't know. I don't think it's a small, highly talented, highly skilled, maybe highly empathetic, you would add to that, and intelligent organization. I think it's a shared political perspective, framework, program, and vision to sustain all that is widely shared, not narrowly shared, with a narrow. Look, I'll even grant you, if there's no alternative to the understanding and the comprehension and the program and the vision can only be held by a few people, I'd rather that than by nobody. Well, that they were acting, positively than not. But I don't think that's the case. And I think that if it is held by a few, it is highly unlikely that they will retain the good values and the good behavior, so to speak, and the good agenda. So I want it held by more. And that's why, for me, that's why I write something like No Bosses, which is trying to do what? It's trying to, with regard to the economy. And I don't think the economy is everything. I think we need vision for kinship, and we need it for culture, and we need it for the political system. But for the economy, No Bosses trying to say, look, here's a proposal for a way to do economics other than capitalism and other than 20th century socialism. And if it's no good, improve it. If it's good, then for Christ's sakes, let's jointly advocate it. Let's collectively advocate it and let's use it to develop program and to develop our commitments, and then improve it as we go. I think something like that is going to be necessary. What you're pointing to as the failures of these things is that they come from anger, they come from short-term desire, and they last for relatively short periods. It shouldn't be that surprising.
I'm going to bring up somebody who, in a weird way, the Friedman, gosh,
Milton Friedman?
Milton Friedman, yes, I'm going to bring up Milton Friedman. He's the neoliberal economist and free market absolutist. That guy, Milton Friedman.
Yeah. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. And one of the things about Milton Friedman that he would argue is that the great thing about capitalism is that when it's running properly through free market and free association, is that it actually cuts against corruption, right? That you disincentivize the authoritarian impulses and corruption and so on, he would say. And I don't agree with that that his conclusions about how capitalism functions, but I do agree with the notion that if we have a system of interaction and production that functions well, it won't really require the best of intentions be in the heads of all the players, that it will disincentivize the worst kinds of behaviors. I can't believe that I couldn't remember Milton Friedman. Is it that I'm stressed?
I don't think it has anything to do with Milton Friedman. I think but your saying if you have a good society, what that means is you have institutions which actually facilitate and even provoke the kind of good outcomes that you're looking for.
Right.
You don't
the
want
invisible
to
hand of the market is what the capitalists would say does that, right?
Yeah, but
and
that's
I don't
nonsense.
agree with them. Right, I don't agree with them about that doing it, but I think some sort of institutional structure and kind of the unwritten or maybe not always consciously understood rules of interaction, they should be set up to mediate our existence. Yeah.
But that's exactly what participatory economics does.
I know. Yeah.
So, I mean, or it claims to do anyway.
Yeah.
It isn't the case now, but I can give you lots of examples of that under participatory economics. It's trying to create a situation in which basically for you to get ahead, you personally, right? Let's say you're a narcissistic egomaniac or whatever the hell, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's only half true, okay? But go on.
Okay. So you're out for yourself, right? So you want to, one set of people thinking about the future would say there's no such thing, right? In other words, the way I like to joke about it is that they say everybody's Mother Teresa. Okay, but in other words, everybody's Che, everybody's whoever you want. They'll behave perfectly, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't think there's any reason to think that. And certainly antisocial behavior could be way less even now, right? But you want a situation in which even the person who is callous to others, right, to advance self has to behave in a way that also advances others. You can't get ahead by, I mean, of course you can steal things. You can walk down the street and take the ice cream cone out of the kid's hands. But setting that aside for a minute, because that's outlawed in any society, in other words, there's nothing in the social structure, there's nothing in the roles of society which even allows you to advance by hurting others. To personally advance, you have to either do something that is equitable and just. You're getting rewards that don't impinge upon others, or you're improving everybody's rewards by increasing output or by improving the quality of jobs and circumstances. That's the way you want to set things up. I agree with you. And then there'll still be violations, but they'll be relatively modest. And it also would be the case that it's almost impossible to get away with anything, right? Not because of surveillance. It's because now if you steal and you're good at it, right? And so you have a lot of you have a lot of wealth, you have a lot of income from stealing. I can't look at that and say to myself, he's a thief, right? But if you have an equitable society, it's impossible to have that kind of wealth, that kind of income. So what you'd have to do is risk your reputation and, I guess, being punished, right, to steal, and then you'd have to enjoy it in private, right, because you can't display it, right?
Yeah.
So that's what it means by the circumstances sort of start to conspire almost. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you that inequity itself sets up corruption
Yeah, of
in this
course.
society. And a good example of that would be Elon Musk. It's not so much that you just know it from looking at the level of wealth that he has, although that's a good indicator. But if you actually know the details, the way he made quite a lot of money at the outset, if I understand this correctly, is, and I don't want to be litigated against, and I'm worried about that in ways I never have been in the past. But my understanding, and this is not, I look it up for yourself, is that he would let people open up PayPal accounts in the early days, and if they only had a small amount in there, he would just take it. And then if they wanted to try to get it back from him, they would have to use a legal system to do so. And if they were so impoverished that they had so little money in the PayPal to begin with, the likelihood would be that they wouldn't be able to afford.
He probably told himself he was doing them a favor. Back in the days when we had South End Press, and so you work with warehouses who distribute stuff, and there's fees. And I started to look at the billing from them, and I discovered there were errors every so often. That's okay, there were mistakes. Then I discovered that the errors were always in one direction. There was never an error that benefited us. There were always errors that benefited them, right? And that's markets. That's actually deemed to be sensible behavior. You try to take advantage of every possibility to accrue market share and wealth, including those, and that's corruption. Right? It's theft. And of course, if you have a situation where it's too costly for anybody to challenge it, great,
and you probably didn't challenge these distributors. I guess it was your distributors.
Well, we did.
You did. and did you win?
Yeah, but what we did is we stopped paying them, and we continued, and we talked them into doing the books. And so the printer, this was the printer who where we found these things. The printer, we kept owing them more and more. And they kept saying to us, you got to pay, or we're not going to print anymore. And we would say to them, yeah, but if you don't print anymore, we're going to switch to another printer and you'll never get a penny from us. And so they would say, well, what do we have to do? And I say, well, why don't you just print this new book and we'll get some revenues from it, and then we'll be able to pay you some. They played hard, played with us, and we played back.
Wow, God. Did you used to have to take medications to do your job? No. It just sounds horrible. What I want in the world is for printers to print the books, you to pay them to print the books, for them to give you the revenue when you sell the books. They're not to overcharge you. Correct.
That's the current system.
Where's Milton Friedman?
That would be
Milton
nice
Friedman
in the current system. But that has nothing. That's not free markets. Free markets, that has nothing to do with. Free markets generate the environment which makes it possible, and in fact wise, right, and sensible, to be corrupt.
Well, I mean, in your story, there's two sides to it, right? I mean, on one hand, they were incentivized to try to bilk you, and especially since you were a smaller press,
right,
they thought they could get away with it, and that you wouldn't have any power to do anything about it. But you told them something which Milton Friedman would be so happy about. If you don't print our next book, we'll go to another printer, and you will never get a penny from us. and that shows that if in a truly free market there would be competition and blah 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 blah.
You
I'm
do
just trying.
understand that it does show that, I hope.
Well, look, obviously monopolies will form in any capitalist system. From a Marxist perspective, you cannot avoid the concentration of capital and monopoly power from emerging in a capitalist society. But I just want to give my opponents their due and say, look, when you describe your ability to go to a competitor as the way that you press back on these people who are corrupt against you, you are, in that moment,
taking advantage of
Milton Friedman's kind of
there
position.
are
Yeah.
that there are other firms. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's, there's more than one aspect to. I mean, basically, there was a period in the world where there was sort of closest to free markets, right? To small active, and it was in England at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it was also when you had child labor, down to the age of 8, and you had rats running through it was horrendous.
Right. And
why?
you
Because
had the
everybody
state
had to compete to
right. And you had the state coming in and doing the enclosure movement and pushing small farmers off their land, and it was a terrible nightmare. Like, I'm not advocating in any way.
Oh, you are too. I'm going to spread it around. It's all along. You've been doing it all your life. You've been what do you call it?
I'm canceled.
What do you call it when it's no.
I'm a crypto capitalist or something.
These are too modern for me. It's the sort of soldier for the other side that is they call it fifth column.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah. So you've been a fifth column infiltrating and corrupting us all.
Yeah, but if so, I'm a Manchurian candidate. I mean, I don't know it. I have handlers somewhere.
Okay, there you
go. They hypnotize
off the hook.
Me. Yeah. I plead insanity. Okay. So, but I just like to think about. I actually, as a Marxist, as a wannabe Marxist, find it useful to listen to the propagandists for capitalism, and to take them as seriously as possible when I can, because Marxist analysis of capitalism is saying, look, the capitalism in bourgeois society cannot get to its own aims. The vision of the Enlightenment and the capitalism of the bourgeois society is one of equity and freedom and so forth. And so, and it's worth remembering that, and worth remembering the arguments made in favor of capitalism. So, because what I worry about is a kind of socialism which will rely on small scale, almost familial relations, and attitudes of free individuals who often enough will end up having to be something like subsistence farmers to have the level of independence that
they used to call it bioregionalism. So it was basically a stance that said small is beautiful, large is horrendous, and decentralized, meaning not a decentralized institutional framework, but meaning spread and self-reliant. Juche was in Korea, it was called. Anyway, and so you listen to that and think about it, and I agree with you completely that if you want to critique something, the first thing you should be able to do is defend it. In other words, you should be able to make the case as well or better than they make it, and then critique. But the problem with bioregionalism was that ultimately the heart of it was, let's say we're producing bicycles, we need bicycles, and the heart of bioregionalism was the claim that if you produce them centrally, so you produce the bicycles, let's say in Detroit and Denver, I don't know, and you have to ship the bicycles all over the country because people want bicycles and need bicycles all over the country. And that shipping of the bicycles, they would claim, is ecological nightmare. It shouldn't have to be. And so they would say what we should do is produce the bicycles all over the country so that you can get rid of that unnecessary activity. Well, if you think about that for 5 minutes, you sort of ask yourself, well, wait a second. If we're producing bicycles all over the country, how do we do that? There's no steel. There's no rubber. There's no.
You have to ship those things in.
So you have to ship those things, and so it turns out that because you've given up economies of scale, and you've given up that it's not even better ecologically, much
Right.
less any other way, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you have to think about things to figure them out. But I would agree with you completely, and I'll give myself a little nod here. When we were in the 60s, in the late 60s, and going into the 70s, Marxism-Leninism was a big deal. It's all over the place. People seemed to have answers for things. They were confident, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I was never much attracted to it. I was attracted to elements of it, for sure, because elements of it. But as a whole framework, I didn't like it, particularly the Leninist parts of it. Neither did Robin, and who I did lots of writing with. So we wrote a book called Unorthodox Marxism. And you notice we hadn't even jettisoned the word Marxism, unorthodox Marxism. And the first, I don't remember exactly, but maybe 3 or 4 chapters, something like that, presented the case for Marxism, right? So in other words, we were arguing this is the intellectual framework that is best. And then after that came the critique. And I think probably the, I don't know what to call it, maybe the biggest compliment I've ever received in some sense was to learn that there were various Marxists who were using the first 4 chapters in their courses to present Marxism, to make the case for Marxism, and then closing the book, right? Never dealing with it. And I thought, well, that's good. That was the point. We wanted to be able to make the case for Marxism as good or better than Marxists make the case. And
I've never read that book.
You'd find it interesting, I think.
Yeah, if you'll give me permission to use your intellectual property, I think I'd like to take a look at your book and make a series of videos in response to it, because
do as you please. But what happens if you discover that you want to make videos advocating it?
Oh, well, I'm sure there'll be aspects of it that I will advocate. I think that
it's very early, right?
Yeah.
In other words, this is back, I don't even know when it was.
I am amongst Marxists. I am not the typical Marxist in terms of my feelings about the state, for example. My orthodoxy comes down to a commitment to what's sometimes called, I think wrongly, but sometimes called the esoteric Marx, the side of Marx that talks about abstractions like value and things like that. That's where I get my knickers in a bunch.
The problem is, first of all, who cares what Marx said? That's disaster. How could anybody say such a thing? But I don't care what Einstein said either. What you care about is the living ideas, not that somebody said it, right? But a little more than that. Look, everybody on the left is a Marxist in some sense, right? Just like everybody on the left is, everybody who's a physicist is a Newtonian, right? Except in the sense that you think he's wrong. But lots of it is right. And so lots of Marxist insights from him and from subsequent generations of Marxists are right and are powerful and are valuable.
The reason why I think you should care what Marx said is if you are trying to critique a theory or a system, you should know what it is.
Yeah, but that means you should know what Marxism is, not what Marx said. You don't critique. Listen to this analogy and tell me if you think this is true. You don't critique relativity theory, right? By looking at what Einstein said. Who cares, right? You might look at that for historical reasons or for biographical reasons or for personal reasons to understand the mind of a person.
What about E equals MC squared and that the whole argument through mathematical equations to demonstrate that? If you want to get beyond relativity and you start, and I mean, the problem is it's not a fair comparison to really do physics and politics as if they're the same. But I think that in the realm of physics, you have these mathematical abstractions that people deal with and they focus on. And there's very little room, in my understanding, and I'm not a physicist, for a lot of fudging or conflation. Right?
And
And the realm of Marxism, the whole history of Marxism has been a political
fudges.
process of of contesting what really applies to the world and what doesn't in
And look
Marx.
at
And
what you're
starting in
suggesting.
the late 19th
And
century.
look at what you're suggesting. We
Yeah.
should look not at today's Marxists, at today's framework, but we should look at what somebody was saying, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when the world was quite a different place. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me unless you're telling me that, well, Carl and a few other people who lived then were, to current Marxists, the best current Marxists. They were just head and shoulders above them intellectually. Their brain power was so much greater. That's nonsense, right? That's
Well,
just
okay.
nonsense.
Well, let's see if I can counter that.
I'm not sure whether we want to go down this
I mean,
road,
I'm just a
but
little bit more, and then I'll
okay.
stop. All right, you'll win. I'll let you win in the end. Okay. But here's what I'll say to that is that
Okay.
again, it's not so much. I don't know the IQ of Karl Marx. Okay,
Yeah.
I
Who
just
does?
all I know is that I've read and understood Capital Volume 1 to some degree, right?
Yeah.
And then I will read contemporary Marxists who make what I consider to be errors about some basic concepts that would come out of Marx's Capital and his critique of political economy. And that
Fine.
if you look into the history of why that's happened, the history of why that has happened is not because through a rigorous and philosophically sound and let alone scientific process of argumentation, they've come to different conclusions, but rather that there have been conflations of one theory or not with another. There have been politically expedient moves that people have made in the name
Undoubtedly
of
true.
party of unity. And so I feel as though you have to go back and say, okay, what was the argument? Not to say, okay, this is holy writ, but just to say, what is the actual argument? And often enough, the kinds of things that get said in the name of Marxism, even by people who are pretty close to Marx, like Rosa Luxemburg, are, I think, missing some of the key arguments in Capital and some of the key arguments that were developed by
Look,
Heinrich Grossman and others later on.
Undoubtedly, that's true, right?
Mhm.
But the thing that matters, that Marx would say matters, right, is the extent to which an intellectual framework at a particular point in time highlights what needs highlighting, right? Leaves out that which should be left out because to pay a lot of attention to it would be a waste of time. Provides the tools, the concepts that we need to move forward, right? And that seems to me to be a set of criteria that it makes sense to apply. Now, you want to apply to it to something that you extract from things that were written a long time ago. Okay, that's fine. But then you have to extract it. You can't keep, as you say, fudging. Pull out the essence of the intellectual framework and then deal with it. And if the essence of the intellectual framework is so foggy that you can't get a grip on it, well, that's a problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
If you can get a grip on it, then that's fine. And so that's what we tried to do in that book. And again, that was a long time ago, but we tried to say, look, this seems to us to be the essence of a Marxist intellectual framework of the sort that is popular now and that you can trace back to, the school of thought. And here are the things that we think are wrong with it or are lacking, left out, etc. I can't even remember. I don't even remember if in the book on Orthodox Marxism we already had, the third class thing, which to me is the biggest thing. I mean, to me, it goes like this in a nutshell, right? First big problem with Marxism as a broad, right? Its overemphasis on economics relative to race, gender, and political power. It seems to me that it's more functional in the modern world. It's more likely to provide tools that people can use to understand and change the world, to not a priori impose that, to realize that those other domains. So that was the first set of concerns that we raised. Oh, that's all the way back in 69, 70, something like that. And since then, I think Marxism has in fact modified itself in light of those concerns to a considerable extent. So you had things like socialist feminism, or Marxist nationalism, or anarcho-Marxism, or all these things, which were essentially saying, okay, we're going to broaden out the perspective of Marxist thought, of this particular thought, call it X thought, whatever you want, right? To take into account these other spheres of life and to give them the point of priority comparable to the economic point of priority. So that was the first concern. The second concern was more fundamental, that it fucks up understanding the economy. Now that's going to drive most Marxists crazy. But for us, that was the much more fundamental critique. The first critique could be accommodated, and it has been to a considerable extent. The second critique we thought couldn't be accommodated. And it was indeed, some things associated with value and so on and so forth. But basically, seeing capitalism as essentially a two-class phenomenon instead of a three-class phenomenon. That was a really crippling conceptual blow, leaving out the label of the reality of this thing called the coordinator class. And then there arises, then the critique becomes more aggressive when you follow a Marxist advisory. And the Marxist advisory is, if you're trying to understand an intellectual framework and you're trying to understand what it's about and what it's really about, you don't ask its advocates, right? Because they're going to have, that's like asking Bill Clinton what neoclassical, what bourgeois economics is about. You don't ask Bill Clinton. You don't ask Elon Musk, right? You look at the intellectual framework, and this is Marx. You look at the intellectual framework and you ask yourself, what's missing? What does it leave out? What does it not address? And in whose interest is it to not address that thing? This is exactly what Robin and I did with Marxism. And we said to ourselves, whether rightly or wrongly, we said to ourselves, what it leaves out is literally the existence of the coordinator class, in the same way that neoclassical economics more or less leaves out the existence of owners, right? It doesn't really pay much attention to them. So Marxism doesn't pay much attention to this coordinator.
Well,
and it becomes the ruling class, right? That was the thing that we, sort of mind-blowing, but Marx was right. If you ask what the intellectual framework facilitates, and you look at it this way, you'd predict that it would facilitate that this group that's not paid attention to, but that has, by its very situation, lots of power, is going to rise to dominance.
I want to say something about that, and then I want to ask you one more question, and then we should probably go. So, I'm trying to go on memory of how I believe Marx thought about class and capital and other writings, and in a sense, the most important class, the class that actually rules but unconsciously or in an alienated way, is only one, and that's labor. And from a Marxist perspective, because labor is the generator of the value that determines the relationships in society.
Maybe this is just gobbledygook.
Well, I mean,
all right. I mean, it's saying, well, it's a truism if you say, well, people who do work generate the value, and therefore they,
Yeah, but I mean, but this is why, understanding the theory matters a bit, because it's not just that they generate the wealth. Okay, that they actually generate the things we use. There's that, but they also generate the social value, this abstraction that sets up exchanges, that makes things exchange as equivalents, that there's things that are embodied in commodities that measure, all this stuff. And so they create that value. And then there's the capitalist class, which claims property, and to control the capital that is both wealth, but also an abstract financialized wealth or money wealth.
Yeah.
They can, so that those two things exist. The form that the capitalist class takes, whether it's private entrepreneurs or states or what have you, to me isn't that important. And there's this other thing that emerges, and I think Marx has no problem with this either. The people who are not producing value, but are being employed as managers or
what do you mean
as
they're not
teachers.
producing value? Of course they
They're
produce
not,
value.
they don't, they neither are reproducing, like, I'll give an example of someone who doesn't produce value, but does produce something of practical use. You're an advertising executive. You produce advertising to sell a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
The advertising that you're making is not a commodity in itself. It's not going to go into the market and be exchanged. It is
Actually, it is, but we'll let
well,
it slide.
I mean, perhaps it depends, but like when they made the Coca-Cola, I'd like to teach the world to sing song, that became a commodity because it was sold in the market on LPs and things. But for most of the time, you're holding it's a kind of financialized property. So it's property that you've created, and the worker who creates the property is not creating new value. It's only valuable through this, like, as because someone can claim ownership of it and collect rent on it, or
what makes
like that.
a basketball valuable?
What makes a basketball valuable as an exchange, like as a commodity, as an exchangeable commodity, is the amount of labor time that it took to produce the basketball.
I mean, it would take us a while, but I don't think that's true. I don't think it has much to do with anything.
Yeah, I mean, if you reject that, then yeah, we're on a different. I mean,
I won't even reject it for a second.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if I put a lot of time into producing something, right,
mm-hmm.
but that thing isn't wanted, right,
mm-hmm.
it's junk. It's
True.
Nothing. I might have. Okay.
Marx would say the same thing.
Right, anybody rational would say it. So, and
mm-hmm.
if somebody is employed at some workplace, right,
mm-hmm.
to produce advertising, meaning designs and song lyric, whatever, right,
mm-hmm.
And it's no good, then it's worthless. And the person probably eventually gets fired. If
mm-hmm.
it's good, it's of value to somebody. In fact, it doesn't make any sense to me to say, but in any event, if the way that you think of things, right,
mm-hmm.
is confined to viewing ownership on the
mm-hmm.
one hand, and viewing, I guess, time spent producing, and let's say it's something that's socially valued, right, instead of waste,
mm-hmm.
and that's all you pay attention to, it's powerful for many reasons that we agree on.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're not paying attention to is that in the act of producing, you're not only producing the basketball or whatever it is, right? You're producing the worker the next day. And
mm-hmm.
you're affecting the worker's consciousness, and you're affecting the worker's skill level, and you're affecting
mm-hmm.
the worker's connections to other workers, and so on
mm-hmm.
and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And what if some ways of doing that have dramatic effects on people and elevate them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is precisely, I mean, see, it's not as if we're not saying something beyond the economy is causing this third class. We're saying this third class that we're talking about is a natural outgrowth, partly of the motives of capitalists as the economy grows and they have to have managers and so on and so forth. But it's a natural outgrowth of the effects of the work on the people doing it,
mm-hmm.
right? And to a degree also the training that goes into it.
No, look, I'm by putting forward this theory of value that Marx, that I thought I read about in Capital. I'm not. Yeah, I know, but I'm not critiquing. I'm not even intending to level a critique at Paracon per se.
I know.
That moment, yeah. And I do agree with you that if you could accomplish the job complexes that you want to accomplish, and you could make the economy function the way you envision it functioning, that it would have the impact on workers to empower them and to expand their realm of creativity and to overcome what I see as this social abstraction of value, which you see as something completely different.
What I see is getting rid of class division.
Well, right. It would have to do both. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the same thing ultimately. But I look forward to getting a hold of your book, critiquing Marxism, and,
okay.
and making a series of videos about it. We've been talking for about an hour.
Okay.
I want to tell everyone though here at the end that they should go ahead and purchase No Bosses, and even if they're fans of me and feel like maybe they shouldn't because I'm no longer with the company. Listen, I get royalties on Michael's books.
Do you really?
Yeah, a small royalty on the books that I commissioned. So, so I mean, if they honor it, but they should. So yeah, you'll be helping Michael. You'll be helping me. Buy his book, and you know, and then hopefully,
I'm afraid I have to make a little addition here.
But
don't buy it to help Doug. Don't buy it to help me. Buy the book because it claims, right, to put forth a alternative. You know, there is no alternative. This claims to put forth an alternative. If that's true, it's valuable. If that's false, show that it's false and help to do better.
Yeah.
Because we do need an alternative.
What I was going to say at the end of this, Michael, was buy it to help me, buy it to help Michael, and then after you read it, act so that we don't get shit for these things anymore, and we have a whole new economy.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.